This is basically, the translation of this is, the good people who eat what is left from the sacrifice are released from all sins, but those wicked people who prepare good for their own sake, verily they eat sin. So Krishna Bhagwan here is using the word sant, which is a saint, for people who eat what is left from sacrifice, meaning that they're great people, and they are released from all sins. So similar to what we talked about in the previous sessions about not being selfish in the world because everyone is important. Here, Shri Krishna is using a very simple principle that, people question in life, is the world made for me or am I made for the world? And there's always the conflict between the two. But, the person who sort of thinks that the world is, for them and they're the centre of everything, is actually a sinner, whereas the person who's able to enjoy that which they have and share it with others is considered to be a saint. So the person that has the attitude that they'll try to help the world as much as possible and try to give a part of them to the world, that person becomes a saint. So Srimad Vallabhacharya Ji has written some commentary on this particular verse and talked about, the types of sacrifices that you get from God's form. And he says that those people who take part in prasad, all of us get given prasad at mandirs or at home, that person will never be able to fall into sin if they enjoy that prasad. And everything, because basically giving prasadam is sort of a sacrifice, and that is a selfless action. And as a result, that which is remaining from the prasad is actually very pure. So if we then take that food in ourselves, our sins are then removed. Earlier in the previous verses, we saw that sacrifice removes selfishness and leads to selflessness. And after this, our sins can naturally not stay, and our selfishness is eliminated all the way. And basically, God is the only thing that then stays with us, and therefore there can't be any sin. Swami Akhanand Saraswati gives us a really beautiful example of when he was a child, and he was living next door to a neighbour who was quite wealthy, and that particular person had a rule that whenever anyone came to his house, that person would be fed. And this person, whilst he was wealthy to start off with and he was feeding everybody, he kept having lots and lots of people coming to his house, and he continued to feed them. And his wealth did keep reducing, but in his eyes this was a sacrifice of giving people food. And one time there was a time where someone came to his house at night and there wasn't any wood that he could use to burn and use as, sort of heat to cook the food. So what he did is he took a part of his bed and he broke that and used that as, the wood to create some food, heat to make some food for this guest. And this was the extent of which, he would be committed to fulfilling this sacrifice. He used to cook the food for the guest, and his wealth kept reducing, but he continued to feed those people that came. And because he had limited wealth, he then started to go hungry as well, without eating. But it didn't matter to him because he was so committed to performing this sacrifice. So one time, Swamiji went and asked him, what sort of happiness he got from feeding other people and why he did this. And he gave a really beautiful answer, saying that feeding others first and then eating yourself is quite an ordinary thing to do. We do that. But the happiness that you get from feeding another before you is, and then, even if you're hungry yourself, it's just an undescribable feeling, similar to the story that we had last time of the mother that feeds the chicken to her children. And the feeling is just beautiful that she, even though she doesn't get to enjoy it herself, she derives a lot of pleasure from that. So to go on to that, it's really ordinary to feed others first and then to eat yourself. So say, for example, you have 2 chapatis and you have a hungry person in front of you and you give one to them and then you eat one yourself. That's quite normal because you're satisfying your own hunger and you know that you're doing something right. If you don't do that, then there's obviously a problem and you're seen to be a demon. But if you can eat 2 chapatis whilst the person opposite you is hungry, it's impossible for those chapatis to go into your mouth and for you to feel happy. If you give one to them and eat one yourself, that's just human and natural. But then if you give both away and you see the other person eating, but it doesn't really matter because you're actually going to be able to eat again later that day. And that's a unique feeling, that's a different sort of bliss. So Krishna Bhagwan's particularly chosen beautiful words here. He's used the word sant, and he didn't use other words that we have in Sanskrit for the for that same meaning. He didn't use bandit, he didn't use purohit or morvi or father or padri, because all of those have a different sort of sectarian element to them. A pandit would only talk about certain things, a morvi will only talk about his sect, a padri will also only talk about some sects, and this is sort of their duty because that's the position that they're in. A sant, on the other hand, has the freedom to talk about everything. And, for example, that you've got a community leader as well. They'll only particularly talk about their community. Whereas a sant is somebody that can be defined as a person that says the whole world is his and that all communities are his. And there's no one different for him and there are no sects for him. And that's why Sri Krishna has chosen this particular word, sant. It's a great image of a person who, therefore, we can derive that it's a great person who eats that which is left from a sacrifice, and that's considered to be a saint. And that particular person crosses all divisions of all communities and sects. One person who performs a sacrifice, like the one that Sri Krishna is describing here, can't necessarily belong to any sect because, the Vedas have described the consequences of someone that doesn't perform a sacrifice, and we looked at this last time. And, if we try to understand this, there's a line in the Atharvaved which says, Ayagnyo pata vacharvati, and that means the one who doesn't perform a sacrifice has their power eliminated and their strength eliminated. And in the Rigved, it is said, Aya jvana sanakana preti miyuhu, which means that one that doesn't perform a sacrifice might give donations, but he also will be eliminated because basically he's giving a donation without, the key element which is required, which is the attitude of sacrifice. So we'll see further on in the Gita that Sri Krishna will go on to describe different types of charity on the 17th chapter, and he'll describe what makes a good donation, what makes a passionate donation, and what makes a dull donation. So when you give it, I'm sure we've probably experienced this in our own lives as well, when you give a donation that's given with the attitude of sacrifice, that's considered to be a true donation. I joke about this with my brother. When he gives me money at Raksha Bandhan, does he give it to me just because he's just giving it, because he doesn't know what else to do, or because he's actually giving it with that same feeling? So that's perhaps a similar example. If a donation's given without the attitude of sacrifice, then that person's eliminated. And there's another mantra which says, Shasas taminda martyam ajayam shasvas pate, which means, O Indra, you punish the human that doesn't perform a sacrifice. And in the Rigved, it said, Nayam param pushyati no shakayam kevalago bhavati kevaladi. And if you read various commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, you'll find all of them will quote this mantra. And it basically means that he who eats alone without breaking his food into portions and doesn't give food to others is eating sin and incurs sin. Guruji's given an example of in India that elderly people would tell him that the person eating alone would get mumps on their cheeks, and once these mumps were formed, they wouldn't be able to eat. So this is quite an interesting example. It's basically the same elements of sharing what we have with others. And in the Manusmriti, it said, Agam se kevalam puteya pachanya atmakanap morgan anhayam pachate vaha, which means he who does things for himself incurs sin. So again, going back to the point of being selfish. And one who doesn't perform a sacrifice will eat wasteful food. So this is, drawing parallels on what we've seen before, again, about sharing that which we have. In terms of economics, the wealth that we have should also be circulated in society. So if we move on now to verse 14.